The story begins with the protagonist recounting their first encounter with the abandoned theater, a once grand building now shrouded in darkness and neglect. The atmosphere is thick with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of decaying wood or the distant rustle of something unseen. As the protagonist steps through the heavy ornate doors, they are immediately struck by a sense of overwhelming unease, as if the theater itself is alive, watching their every move. The air inside is stale, carrying the faint, musty odor of rotting fabric and forgotten memories. Dust dances in the dim beams of light that filter through the cracked windows, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to move with a life of their own. The protagonist, a seasoned actor seeking a fresh start, tries to brush off the discomfort, attributing it to the natural anxiety of beginning a new project. But as they wander deeper into the theater's labyrinthine corridors, the feeling intensifies, a creeping sensation of being watched, hunted even. Every step echoes ominously, reverberating through the cavernous space, and with each sound, the protagonist's heart beats a little faster. The shadows in the corners seem to stretch out, reaching for them, and the silence is almost suffocating, pressing down like a weight on their chest. As they make their way to the stage, the protagonist can't shake the feeling that they are not alone. The ancient seats, once filled with audiences captivated by the performances on stage, now stand empty, rows upon rows of them, facing the stage like silent, judgmental spectators. The protagonist's footsteps sound deafening in the stillness, the noise bouncing off the walls and returning as a distorted echo that seems to mock them. Their breath quickens, and for a moment, they swear they see a figure in the corner of their eye, a fleeting glimpse of something or someone lurking in the dark. But when they turn, there's nothing, just the empty theater and the oppressive darkness. Despite the growing dread gnawing at the edges of their mind, the protagonist forces themselves to continue, driven by a mixture of curiosity and stubbornness. They approach the stage, its once polished wooden boards now dull and splintered, and as they step onto it, a sudden chill washes over them, as if the temperature has dropped several degrees. The protagonist shivers, but it's not just the cold. It's the feeling of something wrong, something deeply unnatural about this place. The air seems to hum with an unseen energy, and the protagonist's instincts scream at them to leave, to get out before it's too late. But they stay, frozen in place, as if held by an invisible force. Then, from the darkness above, a sound, soft at first, but growing louder, a slow rhythmic creaking, like the groan of old wood under strain. The protagonist looks up, their eyes searching the rafters, but sees only darkness. The sound continues, echoing through the empty theater, a haunting melody that sends chills down their spine. It's as if the theater itself is breathing, alive with a malevolent presence that lurks just out of sight. The protagonist's skin prickles with goosebumps, and they feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them, watching, waiting. In a desperate attempt to break the spell of terror, the protagonist calls out, their voice trembling, echoing back at them from the far reaches of the theater. But there is no response, only the deepening silence and the relentless creaking from above. Panic begins to set in, their mind racing with thoughts of escape, but their legs feel heavy, as if rooted to the spot. The darkness seems to close in around them, the shadows growing longer, darker, more menacing, until it feels like the walls themselves are closing in. Just as the protagonist is about to flee, a single sharp sound pierces the silence, a loud echoing bang, like a door slamming shut in the distance. The noise reverberates through the theater, and in that moment, the protagonist feels a surge of pure, unadulterated fear. Their heart pounds in their chest, the instinct to run nearly overpowering, but instead, they stand frozen, listening as the echoes fade into the silence. The theater is alive with terror, a malevolent force that seems to be toying with them, and as the protagonist finally turns to leave, they can't shake the feeling that something is following, something hidden in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike. As they rush out of the theater, the protagonist's mind is a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Haunted by the sense that they have disturbed something that should have been left alone, the outside world feels cold and alien. The familiar sights and sounds tainted by the lingering dread of what lies within the theater. The protagonist can't shake the feeling that they've crossed a threshold, that the theater has left a mark on them, one that will continue to haunt them long after they've left its dark, oppressive halls. The stage is set, and the curtain is about to rise on a nightmare that has only just begun. As the days progress, the protagonist begins to notice unsettling changes around them. Subtle at first, but growing increasingly disturbing. The once innocuous theater, which seemed merely old and abandoned, starts to reveal its darker side. It begins with small, almost imperceptible shifts. Props on the stage move slightly from where they were left. Scripts appear out of place, and the stage curtains, heavy and thick with dust, seem to sway gently even when there is no breeze. The protagonist initially tries to rationalize these occurrences, attributing them to the drafty building or the forgetfulness of the cast and crew. But deep down, a gnawing sense of dread takes root, whispering that something is terribly wrong. The unease escalates when the protagonist starts hearing faint whispers echoing through the empty corridors of the theater. These voices are indistinct, like the murmurs of an unseen audience, just on the edge of perception. Sometimes they hear their own name called out in a voice that is both familiar and alien, a chilling tone that sends shivers down their spine. The whispers are most intense when the protagonist is alone, rehearsing late at night. They try to ignore them, focusing on the script, but the words on the page start to blur, the lines of the play intertwining with their own thoughts, creating a sense of disorientation that is impossible to shake. Sleep offers no refuge. The protagonist's dreams become a twisted mirror of their waking life, filled with vivid and terrifying images that blur the line between dream and reality. They find themselves back in the theater, standing on the stage under a harsh spotlight, surrounded by a faceless audience that watches in utter silence. In these dreams, the protagonist performs scenes from the play, but the lines are wrong, twisted into something dark and menacing. The other actors' faces are distorted, their eyes hollow and accusing, as if they blame the protagonist for something unspeakable. Each night the dreams grow more intense, more real, leaving the protagonist drenched in sweat and paralyzed with fear when they awaken. The boundary between dream and reality continues to erode when the protagonist starts seeing things that shouldn't be there. During rehearsals, they catch glimpses of shadowy figures in the wings, just out of sight. These figures move quickly, vanishing the moment the protagonist turns their head, leaving only the sensation of being watched. On more than one occasion, the protagonist finds themselves alone in the dressing room, staring into the mirror, only to see a shadow pass behind them. But when they turn around, the room is empty, silent, save for the faint creak of the old building settling. The most unnerving incident occurs when the protagonist arrives at the theater early one morning, determined to get ahead on rehearsals. As they enter the main auditorium, they notice something out of place. One of the seats in the front row, which had been covered in dust and left untouched for years, is now inexplicably clean, as if someone had just been sitting there. The dust that once coated the seat is disturbed, forming a perfect outline of a person, as though the invisible audience member had just risen and left. The sight of it makes the protagonist's blood run cold. They reach out to touch the seat, only to recoil in horror as they find it warm to the touch, as if it had been occupied moments before. Terror takes hold when the protagonist discovers that these disturbances are not confined to the theater. At home, objects begin to move on their own, a chair out of place, a door left open when they were sure they'd closed it, and the most disturbing of all, a photograph of the cast taken on the first day of rehearsals, which now shows one more face than it should. A figure stands at the back, shrouded in shadow, its features obscured, yet somehow familiar. The protagonist's heart pounds in their chest as they stare at the photograph, the realization dawning that whatever haunts the theater is now following them home. The protagonist's paranoia grows as the mystery deepens. They begin to suspect that the play itself is cursed, that the script holds a power they can't understand. Pages of the script start appearing in strange places, in their coat pocket, on the kitchen counter at home, even inside their car. The lines on these pages are different from the ones they remember, twisted and cryptic, filled with dark, foreboding phrases that seem to speak directly to the protagonist's deepest fears. Every time they read these lines, a sense of doom settles over them, as if the words are not merely part of a play, but a prophecy of what's to come. In their desperation, the protagonist tries to confide in the other cast members, but their concerns are dismissed as stress or an overactive imagination. Some of the actors even laugh it off, teasing the protagonist for being too immersed in their role. But there is something in the eyes of the director, a fleeting look of fear quickly masked by a forced smile, that convinces the protagonist that they are not alone in sensing the darkness that surrounds them. However, when they press the director for more information, they are met with vague reassurances and a warning not to dig too deep into the theater's past. The protagonist becomes increasingly isolated, consumed by the growing mystery. Every attempt to uncover the truth only leads to more questions, more fear. The whispers grow louder, more insistent, and the dreams more vivid, until the protagonist can no longer tell where the play ends and reality begins. The sense of dread that permeates every moment of their life becomes unbearable, a suffocating blanket of fear that they can't escape. The theater, once a place of art and expression, has become a prison of nightmares where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper carries the weight of 1,000 untold horrors. The stage is set for a descent into madness, and the protagonist is teetering on the edge, unsure if they will ever find their way back to the light. As the days turn into weeks, the protagonist's descent into psychological terror intensifies. A slow, agonizing spiral into madness. What once seemed like mere coincidence now feels like a calculated assault on their sanity. The theater, with its decaying walls and shadowy corners, becomes a living entity in the protagonist's mind, a malevolent presence that seems to take pleasure in their fear. The whispers that once echoed in the corridors now seem to come from within their own head, a cacophony of voices that mock, threaten, and seduce in equal measure. The protagonist's thoughts become fragmented, their once clear mind now a battleground between reality and the growing darkness within. Isolation creeps in as the protagonist begins to distance themselves from the other actors and crew. Every interaction feels strained, unnatural, as if everyone around them is hiding something. Conversations that were once lighthearted and filled with camaraderie now feel laced with hidden meanings and sinister undertones. The protagonist starts to notice small changes in the behavior of their colleagues, nervous glances, whispered conversations that stop abruptly when they enter the room, and an unsettling calmness that blankets the theater, as if everyone is playing a role in a script only they are unaware of. Paranoia takes root, and the protagonist starts to suspect that they are the subject of a dark, twisted game, orchestrated by forces they cannot comprehend. The protagonist's once firm grip on reality begins to slip as they start seeing signs of a conspiracy, both within the theater and beyond its walls. Objects they had hidden away suddenly reappear in plain sight. Letters and notes in their own handwriting appear in places they swear they never left them. And every day brings new, inexplicable occurrences that erode their sense of self. The most terrifying realization comes when they discover a series of journal entries written in their own hand, yet they have no memory of writing them. The entries detail a growing obsession with the theater, with phrases like, "The play must go on," and "They're watching me," repeated over and over again. The protagonist is horrified by these entries, which seem to chronicle a descent into madness that they are powerless to stop. As the protagonist delves deeper into the theater's history, They uncover a series of tragic events that mirror their own experiences. Previous productions at the theater had been plagued by accidents, disappearances, and even deaths, all of which were dismissed as coincidences or misfortune. The protagonist becomes convinced that these incidents were not accidents at all, but the result of something far more sinister, an ancient curse or a malevolent spirit that haunts the theater, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who dare to perform on its stage. The more they uncover, the more they begin to see connections between the play they are rehearsing and the tragedies that have befallen past productions. The lines between past and present blur, and the protagonist feels as though they are reliving the same horrors that have claimed the lives of others before them. The protagonist's growing obsession with the theater and its dark secrets begins to take a toll on their mental and physical health. They become gaunt, pale, their eyes hollow, and bloodshot from countless sleepless nights spent poring over old scripts, journals, and newspaper clippings. The whispers in their head grow louder, more insistent, demanding their attention at all hours of the day and night. They start to hear their own voice among the whispers, a distorted mocking echo that taunts them with visions of their own demise. The protagonist becomes terrified of mirrors, convinced that their reflection is not their own, but something darker, more sinister, that is slowly taking over their body and mind. In their desperation, the protagonist turns to the one place they feel might hold the answers: the script of the play. They become obsessed with analyzing every line, every stage direction, convinced that the answers they seek are hidden within the text. But the more they study the script, the more it seems to change, the words shifting on the page like a living thing, revealing new and terrifying meanings with each reading. Scenes that once seemed innocuous now take on a sinister tone, filled with veiled threats and dark prophecies. The protagonist begins to see themselves in the characters, their own fears and anxieties reflected back at them in the dialogue. The play becomes a mirror to their soul, reflecting the darkness within. The isolation deepens as the protagonist's fear and distrust of those around them grow. They begin to suspect that everyone in the theater is in on the conspiracy, that they are all actors in a twisted play designed to drive them mad. Every glance, every word, every gesture seems calculated to push them further into the abyss. The protagonist becomes a ghost in their own life, drifting through the days in a fog of paranoia and terror, unable to trust anyone, not even themselves. They stop eating, stop sleeping, stop caring about anything other than uncovering the truth, a truth that seems just out of reach, tantalizingly close yet always slipping through their fingers. As the protagonist's world crumbles around them, they begin to question their own sanity. The whispers in their head become their constant companions, a chorus of voices that never stops, never gives them a moment's peace. The theater, once a place of creativity and expression, becomes a prison, a labyrinth of shadows and secrets that they cannot escape. The protagonist becomes convinced that they are trapped in a nightmare from which there is no waking, a play that will only end with their destruction. They see no way out, no hope of escape. Only the relentless march toward a final, inevitable confrontation with the darkness that has taken hold of their soul. The inner darkness that has consumed the protagonist is now their only reality. A world of fear, madness, and despair where nothing is as it seems and no one can be trusted. The theater has become a reflection of their own mind, a place where the line between reality and illusion no longer exists, where every shadow hides a secret and every whisper carries the weight of their impending doom. The stage is set and the final act is about to begin, but the protagonist can no longer tell whether they are the actor or the audience, the victim or the villain in the tragic play that is their life. The protagonist's descent into terror accelerates as their world unravels, in increasingly horrifying ways. The line between reality and illusion blurs completely, leaving them trapped in a nightmarish limbo where every waking moment is infused with dread. The theater, which once seemed merely eerie, now pulses with a sinister life of its own, its shadowy corners filled with unseen horrors that seem to be waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The air is thick, with an oppressive presence, as if the very walls are closing in, suffocating the protagonist with a malevolent force that grows stronger with each passing day. The stage, once a place of performance and creativity, becomes a battleground where the protagonist confronts their deepest fears. During rehearsals, they begin to see things that shouldn't exist. Flickers of movement in the wings, distorted faces in the audience that vanish when looked at directly, and props that seem to take on a life of their own. The protagonist can no longer distinguish between the play and their own life. Scenes from the script bleed into their reality, and they find themselves reciting lines, even when they're alone, as if the words have embedded themselves in their mind, twisting their thoughts and actions. The whispers that once haunted the protagonist from the shadows now invade their every waking moment, a constant, maddening drone that they can no longer escape. The voices speak in a language they can't fully understand, yet their meaning is clear, a litany of threats, accusations, and dark prophecies that seem to predict the protagonist's imminent demise. The voices are relentless, echoing through the theater and reverberating inside the protagonist's head, growing louder and more insistent until they drown out all other thoughts. The protagonist's mind is a storm of fear and confusion, every coherent thought shattered by the cacophony of voices that command their attention. The protagonist's physical world begins to distort in terrifying ways. The walls of the theater seem to close in on them, the once spacious auditorium, now a claustrophobic prison, where the shadows grow darker and the air thicker with each passing moment. Objects around them start to warp and twist. Doors that once led to familiar rooms now open into dark, unknown spaces. Hallways stretch into infinity or loop back on themselves, and mirrors reflect distorted, nightmarish versions of reality. The protagonist's reflection in these mirrors no longer resembles them, but rather a twisted, tormented figure with hollow eyes and a face contorted in a rictus of fear. The protagonist's perception of time becomes fractured, with days bleeding into nights in an endless, disorienting cycle. They lose track of how long they've been trapped in the theater, whether hours, days, or even weeks have passed. The clocks in the building all show different times, and the sun never seems to rise outside, as if the theater exists in a separate, timeless reality where day and night no longer hold meaning. The protagonist's memories begin to fade, replaced by fragments of the play's script, until they can no longer remember who they were before they stepped onto the stage. The theater becomes their entire world, a place where reality bends and warps at the whim of an unseen, malevolent force. As the protagonist's sanity crumbles, they start to experience terrifying hallucinations that blur the boundary between life and death. They see the ghosts of past performers, their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and accusing as they relive their final moments on stage. These apparitions seem to reach out to the protagonist, their ghostly hands cold and clammy, pulling them further into the darkness that has consumed the theater. The protagonist hears their screams echoing through the corridors, a cacophony of pain and despair that mingles with the whispers in their head, creating a nightmarish symphony that drives them to the brink of madness. The protagonist's body begins to betray them, as if the theater's curse is not only affecting their mind but their physical being as well. They start to experience sudden, unexplained pain, sharp stabbing sensations that shoot through their limbs, a tightness in their chest that makes it hard to breathe, and a constant gnawing ache in their bones that feels like they are being slowly crushed from within. Their reflection in the mirror reveals the toll the theater is taking on them. Sunken eyes, pallid skin, and a gaunt, hollow face that is barely recognizable as their own. They begin to doubt whether they are even still alive, or if they have become one of the tormented spirits trapped in the theater, doomed to relive the same horrors for eternity. The play's script, once a source of confusion, now becomes a chilling prophecy that the protagonist can't escape. The scenes they rehearse begin to predict real events in their life, each act foreshadowing a new horror that they are powerless to prevent. The protagonist starts to see themselves as a puppet, controlled by unseen forces that dictate their every move, leading them inexorably toward a final, terrible conclusion. The fear of what's to come becomes all-consuming as they realize that they are living out a script written by a malevolent hand, one that demands their destruction as the final act. The protagonist's relationships with the other cast members deteriorate as their paranoia and fear drive them to distrust everyone around them. They see conspiracies in every glance, every whispered conversation, and begin to lash out at those closest to them, accusing them of being part of the theater's curse. The cast and crew, once their allies, now seem like enemies, their faces twisted into masks of malice and deceit. The protagonist isolates themselves completely, retreating into the darkest corners of the theater, where the shadows seem to welcome them with open arms, offering a twisted sense of comfort as they descend further into madness. In their final moments of clarity, the protagonist realizes that there's no escape from the theater's grip. The play is no longer just a performance. It has become their reality, a twisted, nightmarish existence where they are both actor and audience, victim and villain. The theater's curse has consumed them entirely, and they are trapped in an endless loop of terror and despair, with no hope of escape. The darkness that has taken hold of their mind is now their only reality, a world of fear and madness, where every shadow hides a secret, and every whisper carries the weight of their impending doom. The final act is upon them, and the protagonist can only watch in horror as the curtain rises on their own destruction. The protagonist, now fully ensnared by the theater's dark influence, reaches a point where they realize they must uncover the truth behind the terrifying events if they ever hope to escape. Yet every attempt to solve the enigma only leads to more confusion, fear, and desperation. The theater, once a place of performance, has become an intricate puzzle. Its every shadow, echo, and whisper a piece of a twisted game designed to trap the protagonist in a web of terror and madness. The search for answers begins with a terrifying discovery: an old, dusty journal hidden in the depths of the theater's basement, buried beneath a pile of forgotten props. The journal's pages are yellowed with age, filled with the frantic scrawl of a former actor who had performed in the same play decades ago. The entries are fragmented, written in a hand that becomes increasingly erratic as the actor's sanity unraveled. The protagonist reads with growing horror as the journal reveals a pattern. Each actor who took on the lead role in the play experienced the same descent into madness, the same haunting visions, the same whispers that now plague the protagonist. The final entries are nearly illegible, the handwriting shaky and smeared with what looks like blood. The last sentence, repeated over and over, chills the protagonist to the bone. The play must go on. Driven by a desperate need to understand, the protagonist dives deeper into the theater's history, uncovering a series of tragedies that seem eerily connected to the current production. Every performance of the play over the years has been marred by accidents, disappearances, and unexplained deaths, all of which were dismissed by authorities as unfortunate coincidences. But the protagonist begins to see a pattern. Each tragedy occurred at the climax of the play, during a scene that involved a ritualistic chant, a chant that seemed to call upon dark forces beyond comprehension. The protagonist realizes that the play itself is a trap, a ritual designed to summon something ancient and malevolent, and that they are the latest victim caught in its snare. The deeper the protagonist digs, the more they realize that the theater is a place where reality bends and warps, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blur. They start to experience horrifying visions, glimpses of past performers, their faces twisted in agony as they relive their final moments on stage. These visions come without warning, flashing before the protagonist's eyes like scenes from a nightmare they can't wake from. The actors appear in mirrors, reflected in the glass with eyes full of despair, their mouths moving silently, as if trying to warn the protagonist, but their words are lost, swallowed by the theater's oppressive darkness. As the protagonist attempts to piece together the puzzle, they are haunted by the increasing sensation that time is running out. The play's opening night is fast approaching, and with it, the climax of the curse. The The protagonist can feel the theater tightening its grip on their soul, a suffocating presence that grows stronger with each passing day. They find themselves drawn to the stage, compelled to rehearse the final scene over and over, as if the play itself is demanding their participation. The other actors, too, seem to be caught in the theater's thrall, their movements mechanical, their eyes vacant, as if they are mere puppets acting out a script they no longer control. In a desperate bid for answers, the protagonist turns to the script, hoping to find a way to break the curse before it's too late. But the script has changed. The lines are no longer the ones they remember, but instead are filled with dark, cryptic phrases that seem to speak directly to the protagonist's deepest fears. The stage directions are twisted, instructing the protagonist to perform actions that make no sense, that seem designed to summon something dark and terrible. The script becomes a living document, its words shifting and changing each time the protagonist reads it, revealing new horrors with every turn of the page. The climax of the enigma comes when the protagonist discovers a hidden chamber beneath the stage, a place where no one dares to go. The entrance is concealed behind a heavy velvet curtain, the kind used in the theater's heyday to reveal scenes of grandeur and drama. But what lies beyond is no ordinary set. It's a place of nightmares, where the walls are lined with ancient symbols carved deep into the stone, symbols that radiate a cold, malevolent energy. In the center of the chamber is a massive, blood-stained altar, its surface covered in the remnants of rituals performed long ago. The air is thick with the stench of decay, and the walls seem to close in, pressing the protagonist closer to the altar, as if urging them to complete a ritual that has been left unfinished for centuries. On the altar, the protagonist finds the final piece of the puzzle, a set of old, crumbling scripts, each one corresponding to a different performance of the play throughout the theater's history. Each script is marked with the name of the lead actor, all of whom met tragic ends. The last script bears the protagonist's name, and as they open it, the pages are blank except for the final scene, a scene that is yet to be written. The protagonist realizes with dawning horror that they are meant to complete the play, to finish the ritual that will bring the theater's curse to its terrifying conclusion. The revelation leaves the protagonist paralyzed with fear. They understand now that the play is not just a performance, but a ritual sacrifice, one that demands their life as the final offering. The theater's curse will only be lifted when the ritual is complete, when the protagonist takes their place on the altar and recites the final lines of the script. But the protagonist is no longer sure what is real and what is illusion, whether they are the victim or the villain, the hero or the sacrifice. The theater has twisted their mind, leaving them trapped in a web of fear and doubt, with no clear path to escape. In their final, desperate act, the protagonist attempts to destroy the script, hoping to break the curse once and for all. But as they set the pages alight, the fire flickers and dies, leaving the script untouched. The words on the page begin to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light, the lines rearranging themselves into a final message that sends the protagonist's heart racing. The play must go on, the sacrifice must be made. With no other options left, the protagonist is forced to confront the unbearable enigma that has consumed their life. They return to the stage, the place where their fate will be decided, the final scene playing out in a theater filled with the ghosts of past performers, all of them watching in silence, waiting for the ritual to be completed. The protagonist's hands tremble as they pick up the script, their eyes scanning the final lines, knowing that the moment they speak the words, the curse will be fulfilled. The stage lights flicker on, casting long, distorted shadows across the theater as the protagonist steps into the spotlight. The audience, unseen but felt, holds its breath as the protagonist begins to speak, their voice trembling with fear. Each word feels like a nail in their coffin, driving them closer to the moment of sacrifice. The theater seems to pulse with anticipation, the darkness closing in as the final line is spoken, sealing the protagonist's fate. In the end, the truth of the enigma is revealed in a blinding flash of light and darkness, as the protagonist's world is consumed by the theater's curse. The play has ended, but the terror continues. leaving the audience with a lingering sense of dread, a feeling that the curse has not been broken but merely passed on, waiting for the next victim to take the stage. The night of the performance finally arrives, casting a pall of dread over the protagonist as they prepare to face the theater's ultimate horror. The air is thick with tension, the kind that suffocates and weighs heavily on the mind, as if the very atmosphere is bracing for the dark spectacle about to unfold. The other actors move like automatons, their faces blank, their eyes hollow, as they go through the motions of their roles. It's as though they've already surrendered to the darkness that has consumed the theater, leaving the protagonist feeling utterly alone, the last remnant of sanity in a world gone mad. As the curtain rises, the protagonist steps onto the stage, their heart pounding in their chest, every beat echoing like a death knell. The theater, now filled with an unseen audience, seems to breathe with anticipation. The protagonist can sense their presence, the weight of countless eyes watching, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. The shadows in the auditorium grow thicker, almost tangible, as if the darkness itself is pressing closer, eager to witness the final act. The lights overhead flicker, casting eerie, shifting patterns across the stage, adding to the sense of disorientation and dread. The play begins, and the protagonist delivers their lines, but the words feel foreign on their tongue, as if they are speaking someone else's truth, not their own. The script has changed yet again, the lines twisting into dark, cryptic phrases that hint at the horrors to come. The protagonist tries to hold on to their sense of self, but the boundaries between reality and performance blur. The two worlds merging into a nightmarish landscape where nothing is certain. Every step, every gesture feels as though it is being guided by an unseen hand, forcing the protagonist to dance to a tune they cannot hear but must obey. As the play progresses, the temperature in the theater begins to drop, an unnatural chill seeping into the bones of everyone present. Frost forms on the edges of the stage, and the protagonist's breath becomes visible in the frigid air. The cold brings with it a sense of creeping dread, a feeling that something ancient and malevolent is drawing nearer with each passing moment. The other actors, their movements jerky and mechanical, seem oblivious to the cold, their eyes glazed over as they continue to recite their lines with an eerie monotony. The protagonist shivers, not just from the cold, but from the growing realization that they are the only one truly alive on this stage. The climax of the play approaches, and with it, the culmination of the curse. The protagonist finds themselves standing in the center of the stage, alone, the spotlight burning down on them with an intensity that feels almost punitive. The final scene requires them to perform the ritualistic chant that has haunted their nightmares, the chant that seems to call upon dark forces beyond human comprehension. As the protagonist begins the chant, their voice trembling, the theater responds. The walls shudder, the lights flicker violently, and the shadows in the audience seem to rise, taking on forms that are both human and monstrously distorted. The protagonist's fear reaches a fever pitch as they realize that the figures in the audience are no longer just shadows, but the spirits of past performers, those who were consumed by the curse before them. Their faces are twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and accusing, as they watch the protagonist with a terrible, silent expectation. The protagonist can feel their gaze burning into them, a collective force of despair and horror that threatens to crush their spirit entirely. The weight of the curse is unbearable, a crushing presence that wraps around the protagonist like a suffocating shroud. With each word of the chant, the protagonist feels a piece of themselves slipping away, consumed by the darkness that now fills the theater. The shadows on the stage grow darker, denser, until they are almost solid, swirling around the protagonist like a storm of malevolence. The air is thick with the stench of decay, a rotting smell that clings to the back of the throat and makes it difficult to breathe. The protagonist struggles to continue, their voice faltering as the terror mounts. But they are compelled to finish the ritual, knowing that stopping now would mean a fate worse than death. As the final words of the chant leave the protagonist's lips, a deafening silence falls over the theater. The darkness presses in, the shadows converging on the protagonist, wrapping around them like the tendrils of some ancient, unknowable force. The spotlight above flickers and goes out, plunging the stage into complete darkness. For a moment, the protagonist is suspended in a void, alone, their senses overwhelmed by the crushing silence and the weight of the curse. It is as if time itself has stopped, leaving them trapped in an endless moment of terror. Then, from the depths of the darkness, a figure emerges. A tall, gaunt shape that seems to be made entirely of shadow, its form shifting and undulating as it approaches. The figure's eyes are empty voids, its face a mask of indescribable horror, and as it draws closer, the protagonist feels a cold so intense it burns, a pain that shoots through their entire being. The figure reaches out with long skeletal fingers, and the protagonist realizes with a jolt of terror that this is the entity they have summoned, the being that the curse has called forth to claim its due. The figure speaks, its voice a low, rumbling growl that seems to vibrate through the very foundation of the theater. The words are unintelligible, but their meaning is clear, a command, a demand for the final sacrifice. The protagonist feels their body being pulled forward, their limbs moving of their own accord as they are drawn toward the figure. The altar that had been hidden beneath the stage now revealed in all its dark, ancient glory. The air crackles with a malevolent energy, the walls of the theater seeming to close in as the final act of the ritual unfolds. The protagonist's mind races as they are laid upon the altar, the cold stone pressing into their back. They struggle against the invisible force that holds them down, but it is futile. The curse has taken hold, and there is no escape. The figure looms over them, its shadowy form blocking out all light, and the protagonist can feel the life draining from their body, their spirit being pulled toward the darkness. The other actors, now fully revealed as the ghosts of the cursed, stand in a circle around the altar, their eyes vacant, their faces twisted in expressions of despair and resignation. They begin to chant, their voices merging with the protagonist's own, a dirge that fills the theater with a sound of unending sorrow. As the protagonist's vision fades, they see flashes of the theater's history, the tragedies that befell the actors before them, the rituals that were performed in secret, the endless cycle of death and despair that the theater demands. They realize with a final, crushing certainty that they were never meant to escape, that the curse is eternal, and that they are now part of the theater's dark legacy. Another soul claimed by the malevolent force that dwells within its walls. In their last moments, the protagonist understands the true horror of the theater. It is not just a place, but a living, breathing entity, a manifestation of the darkest aspects of human fear and despair. The play was never just a performance, it was a ritual, a means of feeding the theater's insatiable hunger for souls. The protagonist's life, their very essence, is consumed by the theater, absorbed into its walls, its shadows, its very foundation. The final act ends not with a curtain call, but with the protagonist's complete and utter obliteration, their existence erased, leaving only the echo of their despair to linger in the darkened halls of the theater. The theater falls silent once more, the darkness receding, the shadows returning to their corners. The other actors disappear, their spirits finally laid to rest, leaving the theater empty and still. The audience, unseen but ever present, disperses into the void, their presence a haunting reminder of the curse that will continue, waiting for the next victim to take the stage. The protagonist is gone, their sacrifice complete, their soul forever bound to the theater's dark, endless cycle. And as the theater stands silent and empty, the script waits patiently, its final line unwritten, ready for the next performance, the next victim, the next soul to be claimed by the darkness that lies within. The climax of the ritual leaves the protagonist teetering on the edge of a terrifying abyss, the very fabric of their reality torn apart by the horrors they have witnessed. The theater, once a mere setting for a performance, has become an inescapable labyrinth of despair, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the real and the imagined, have disintegrated. The protagonist is now a shadow of their former self, their mind fractured, their soul tainted by the dark forces they have unwittingly unleashed. As the final moments of the play fade into silence, the protagonist finds themselves lying on the cold stone of the altar, their body numb, their mind blank with shock. The figure of shadow that had loomed over them moments before is gone, leaving only an oppressive darkness that presses in from all sides, as if the very air is thick with the remnants of the ritual. The stage is empty, the lights dimmed, and the theater itself is eerily still, as though it is holding its breath, waiting for something. Waiting for the protagonist to make their next move. But as the protagonist struggles to rise, they realize that something fundamental has changed. The theater, once a physical space, has transformed into a nightmarish reflection of their own inner torment. The walls seem to pulse with a sickly organic rhythm, as if the theater itself is alive, its very structure infused with the malevolent energy of the curse. The shadows are no longer mere absences of light. They have become sentient, creeping ever closer, reaching out with cold, intangible fingers that brush against the protagonist's skin, leaving a trail of icy dread in their wake. The protagonist staggers to their feet, every muscle aching, their mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. They are no longer certain of anything, not where they are, not who they are, not even if they are still alive. The theater seems to stretch endlessly in all directions, its corridors twisting and looping back on themselves, leading to nowhere and everywhere all at once. The doors that once offered a way out are now sealed shut, their handles icy to the touch, as if the theater is determined to keep the protagonist within its grasp. There is no escape, no sanctuary from the relentless terror that gnaws at their mind. As they wander through the darkened halls, the protagonist begins to encounter the ghosts of those who came before them, the spirits of past actors and performers who, like them, were trapped by the theater's curse. These apparitions are pale, translucent figures, their faces etched with the pain and despair of their final moments. They drift through the theater like lost souls, their eyes vacant, their mouths moving soundlessly as they reenact scenes from the play that claimed their lives. The protagonist tries to speak to them, to ask for help or guidance, but the ghosts do not respond. They are beyond reach, their fates sealed long ago, leaving them to wander the theater for eternity. The protagonist's terror deepens as they realize that these ghosts are not just echoes of the past, but a reflection of their own impending doom. With each step, they feel themselves becoming more like the spirits around them, detached, lost, a part of the theater's dark history. Their memories begin to fade, their thoughts grow disjointed, as if the theater is slowly erasing their identity, absorbing them into its twisted, eternal narrative. The protagonist is no longer sure if they are alive or dead, if they are a person or merely a character in a story that has been playing out for centuries. In a desperate bid to escape, the protagonist returns to the stage, the place where it all began, hoping to find some clue, some answer that might lead them out of the nightmare. But the stage is now a desolate wasteland, a barren expanse of cracked wood and broken props, littered with the remnants of past performances. The spotlight, once a beacon of hope, is now a harsh, glaring eye that follows the protagonist's every move, casting long, distorted shadows that twist and writhe like living creatures. The air is thick with the smell of decay, the stench of rotting wood and mildew mingling with the acrid scent of fear. As the protagonist stands on the stage, they hear a low, ominous rumble that seems to come from deep within the theater's bowels. The ground beneath their feet begins to shake, the floorboards creaking and splintering as if something massive and ancient is awakening beneath the theater. The walls tremble, dust and debris raining down from the rafters, as the theater itself seems to come alive. A monstrous, sentient entity that hungers for the protagonist's soul. The rumble grows louder, more insistent, as if urging the protagonist to complete the ritual, to offer themselves up as the final sacrifice that will appease the dark forces at work. But the protagonist, driven to the brink of madness, refuses to submit. They tear at the script, ripping the pages apart in a frenzy of desperation, hoping to destroy the curse once and for all. But as the pieces of paper flutter to the ground, they do not remain torn. Instead, they reassemble themselves, the words rearranging into new, even more terrifying passages. The script is indestructible, its power too great to be undone by mere human hands. The protagonist realizes with dawning horror that they are trapped in a loop, a never-ending cycle of terror that will repeat itself over and over, with no hope of escape. The final blow comes when the protagonist looks out into the audience, expecting to see the familiar rows of empty seats. But instead, they are greeted by a sea of faces, ghastly, twisted visages that stare back at them with hollow, accusing eyes. The audience is made up of all the souls the theater has claimed over the centuries. Their bodies decayed, their flesh rotting, yet their eyes remain sharp, filled with the same fear and despair that the protagonist now feels. They sit in silent judgment, watching as the protagonist's mind unravels, their presence a constant reminder of the fate that awaits. In a moment of clarity, the protagonist understands the true nature of the theater's curse. It is not just a place of death, but a purgatory, a liminal space where souls are trapped in an endless performance, reliving their darkest fears and regrets for all eternity. The play is a ritual, a cycle of despair that feeds on the fear and suffering of those who dare to enter, binding them to the theater's dark will. The protagonist, now fully consumed by the curse, realizes that they have become part of the theater's twisted narrative, their soul forever entwined with its dark history. With no hope left, the protagonist resigns themselves to their fate. They take their place on the stage, the spotlight blinding them as they deliver the final line of the script, a line that has been spoken countless times before, by countless souls. The play must go on. The words echo through the theater, a final chilling reminder that the curse is eternal, that the theater's hunger for souls will never be sated. As the curtain falls, the protagonist's consciousness fades, their last thought a whispered plea for release, for an end to the nightmare. But there is no end, only the darkness, only the cold, endless void where the theater's victims are condemned to wander for eternity, lost in a world of shadows and despair. And in the silence that follows, the theater waits, patient and hungry, ready for the next victim to take the stage, the next soul to be consumed by the abyss of terror that lies within its walls. The play is over, but the horror continues, a cycle of fear and death that will never end, as long as there are those foolish enough to step into the theater's cursed embrace. The final curtain falls, but the terror does not end. The theater is now a place of suffocating silence, its once grand stage dark and empty, yet charged with a lingering sense of dread. The protagonist, their mind shattered and their spirit crushed, is left standing alone in the oppressive darkness. The ritual is complete, but the sense of finality is elusive. It feels as though something terrible has been set in motion, something that cannot be undone. As the protagonist stumbles off the stage, disoriented and weak, they can still feel the cold, heavy presence of the theater's curse pressing down on them. Every shadow seems to shift and writhe as they pass, as if the darkness itself is alive, watching, waiting for the next move. The air is thick, almost suffocating, with a tension that hangs heavy and unbroken. The protagonist's footsteps echo through the vast, empty space, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet that follows the performance. It feels as though the entire building is holding its breath, waiting to see what will happen next. The protagonist makes their way toward the exit, the need to escape overwhelming. But as they reach the door, they find it sealed shut, just as it was before. Panic rises in their chest as they frantically try to open it, their hands trembling as they pull and twist at the handle. But the door remains locked, immovable, as if the theater itself is refusing to let them leave. The protagonist's heart races as they realize that the theater has no intention of letting them go. They are still trapped, still part of the nightmare that has consumed their life. Desperate, the protagonist turns back toward the stage, hoping to find some other way out. But as they do, they notice something strange. On the stage, where they had stood moments before, there is now a figure, barely visible in the dim light. The figure is seated in one of the old, dusty chairs that had been used as props in the play, their back to the protagonist. The sight of this lone figure, so out of place in the empty theater, sends a chill down the protagonist's spine. They call out, their voice trembling, but the figure does not respond. It simply sits there, motionless, as if waiting for something. The protagonist approaches cautiously, every instinct screaming at them to turn and run, yet something compels them to continue. As they draw closer, they begin to recognize the figure's silhouette, the shape, the posture, the way it sits so perfectly still. It's eerily familiar, a reflection of someone they know all too well. A cold, sinking feeling takes hold as the protagonist finally reaches the stage and steps into the dim light, the figure's identity becoming clear. It's them. The protagonist stares in horror at their own doppelganger, sitting in the chair, facing the empty audience. The figure is an exact replica, down to the clothes, the hair, even the smallest details. But the doppelganger's face is obscured, shrouded in shadow, as if the darkness itself refuses to reveal the truth. The protagonist feels a wave of nausea as they realize that this figure is more than just a reflection. It is something deeper, something tied to the curse that has taken hold of the theater. It's as if the theater has created this shadow self as a final, cruel twist in its unending game. The protagonist reaches out with trembling hands, intending to touch the figure, to prove that it's not real, that this is just another hallucination born of the theater's madness. But as their fingers brush against the figure's shoulder, a shock of cold runs through them, so intense it feels like their very soul is being drained. The figure's head slowly turns, revealing a face that is both their own and yet horribly distorted. A grotesque mirror image that seems to mock them with a twisted grin. The eyes are black voids, empty and endless, pulling the protagonist into their depths. In that moment, the protagonist understands the full scope of the curse. The theater has claimed them completely, erasing their identity, their very essence, and replacing it with this hollow doppelganger. They are no longer the person they once were. They have become part of the theater's eternal cycle. Another soul lost to its insatiable hunger. The doppelganger rises from the chair, standing face to face with the protagonist, the grin widening into something far beyond human, something monstrous and ancient. The theater around them begins to shift, the walls closing in, the shadows deepening into impenetrable blackness. The doppelganger speaks, its voice a distorted echo of the protagonist's own, filled with malice and sorrow. It speaks of the curse, of the countless souls trapped within the theater's walls, all of them forced to relive the same nightmarish performance over and over again. The protagonist feels their last shreds of sanity slipping away as they listen, the weight of the truth crushing them under its unbearable burden. As the doppelganger's voice fades, the protagonist finds themselves back on the stage, the spotlight burning down on them with a cold, harsh light. The theater is no longer empty. The seats are filled with the spirits of those who came before, their faces twisted with fear and despair, their eyes locked on the protagonist. The realization strikes like a blow. This is the final act, the true end of the play. The protagonist is no longer just an actor in the performance. They are the performance, the sacrifice that will keep the theater's curse alive. In a final, desperate act of defiance, the protagonist tries to flee, to escape the inevitable, but their body no longer obeys. The theater's grip is too strong, its will too powerful. They are pulled back to the center of the stage, the doppelganger standing beside them, both of them caught in the unbreakable cycle of the curse. The audience watches in silence, their hollow eyes reflecting the protagonist's terror, as the shadows close in, swallowing the stage, the theater, and everything within it. And then, just as it all seems lost, the lights flicker and go out. The darkness is complete, total, and for a moment, there is nothing. No sound, no movement. Just a void of silence and blackness. The protagonist feels themselves dissolving into the darkness, their consciousness fading as they are consumed by the theater's curse. But just as the last vestiges of their identity slip away, there is a flicker of light, a brief, dim glow that pierces the darkness. The protagonist opens their eyes, finding themselves standing outside the theater, the cold night air biting at their skin. The building looms behind them, silent and dark, as if nothing had ever happened. The streets are empty, the world quiet, and for a moment, it feels as though the nightmare has ended, as though they have somehow escaped. But as the protagonist looks down, they see the script still in their hand, the pages pristine, unmarked by the tears and blood they remember. The words on the page are the same, yet different, the final line waiting to be read. A deep, unshakable dread settles in the protagonist's chest as they realize that the curse is not over, that it may never be over. The theater has let them go, but it has left its mark, a brand that will never fade. The final question hangs in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Did they truly escape, or have they simply become the next vessel for the theater's curse, doomed to carry it forward into the world outside?
Sir,